Hey everybody, welcome to Assignment 3, Chapter 1, First Peoples and First Farmers. Most of history in one section. Tonight you're going to be looking at reading pages 20 through 23, and no questions. Yeah, that's right. So instead of you doing this, you can just sit back, follow along, and enjoy. Some words I'd like you to look for as you're reading are egalitarian, which is a belief that people are equal. It's going to be on page 20, and this mother treats both of her children horribly by throwing them to the ground. So they are equal in that sense. Covet, which is a desire to possess something, and I think it's a bottle of Mountain Dew in there, I think. Pretty sure it is. Next is reciprocal, which is to do something in return, and this is fantastic. Yeah. Dog scratching his back in return. And lastly is monotheistic, which is a belief in one God. And I don't think it's Morgan Freeman, but in that movie he was. So I will join you back here on page 20 just to enjoy. The first human societies. Above all else, these Paleolithic societies were small, consisting of bands of 25 or 50 people, in which relationships were intensely personal and normally understood in terms of kinship. The available technology permitted only a very low population density and ensured an extremely slow rate of population growth. Some scholars speculate that this growth was dramatically interrupted around 70,000 years ago by an enormous volcanic eruption on the island of Sumatra in present-day Indonesia, resulting in a cooler and drier global climate and causing human numbers to drop some 10,000 or less. From that point of near extinction, world population grew slowly to 500,000 by 30 years ago and then to 6 million by 10,000 years ago. Paleolithic bands were seasonally mobile or nomadic, moving frequently and in regular patterns to exploit the resources of wild plants and animals on which they depended. The low productivity of a gathering and hunting economy normally did not allow the production of much surplus, and because people were on the move so often, transporting an accumulation of goods was out of the question. All of this resulted in a highly egalitarian, and highlight that word, egalitarian, societies, lacking the many inequalities of wealth and power that came later with agriculture and urban life. With no formal chiefs, kings, bureaucrats, soldiers, nobles, or priests, Paleolithic men and women were perhaps freer of tyranny and oppression than any subsequent kind of human society, even if they were more constrained by the forces of nature. Without specialists, most people possessed the same set of skills, although male and female tasks often differed sharply. The male role as a hunter, especially of big game, perhaps gave rise to one of the first criteria of masculine identity: success in killing large animals. Relationships between women and men usually were far more equal than in later societies. As the primary food gatherers, women provided the bulk of the family income. One study of the San people, a surviving gathering and hunting society in southern Africa, found that plants, normally gathered by women, provided 70% of the diet, while meat, hunted by men, accounted for just 30%. This division of labor underpinned what anthropologist Richard Lee called relative equality between the sexes, with no one having the upper hand. Among the San, teenagers engaged quite freely in sex play, and the concept of female virginity was apparently unknown, as were rape, wife-beating, and the sexual double standard. Although polygamy was permitted, most marriages were in fact monogamous because women strongly resisted sharing a husband with another wife. Frequent divorce among very young couples allowed women to leave unsatisfactory marriages easily. Lee found that longer-term marriages seemed to be generally fulfilling and stable. Both men and women expected a satisfying sexual relationship, and both occasionally took lovers, although discreetly. When the British navigator and explorer Captain James Cook first encountered the gathering and hunting peoples of Australia in 1770, he described them perhaps a little enviously in this way: They live in tranquility, which is not disturbed by the inequality of conditions. The earth and sea of their own accord furnishes them with all things necessary for life. They covet, and highlight that word, covet, not magnificent houses, household stuff. In short, they seem to set no value upon anything we gave them. They think themselves provided with all the necessaries of life. The Europeans, who settled permanently among such people some 20 years later, however, found a society in which physical competition among men was expressed in frequent one-on-one combat and informal but bloody battles. It also meant recurrent public and quite brutal beatings by wives by their husbands. And some Aboriginal myths sought to explain how men achieved power over women. Among the San, frequent arguments about the distribution of meat or the laziness or stringiness of particular people generated conflict, as did rivalries among men over women. Richard Lee identified 22 murders that occurred between 1920 and 1955, and several cases in which the community came together to conduct an execution of a particularly disruptive individuals. More generally, recent studies have found that in Paleolithic societies, some 15% of deaths occurred through violence at the hands of other people, a rate far higher than in later civilizations, where violence was largely monopolized by the state. Although sometimes romanticized by outsiders, the relative equality of Paleolithic societies did not always ensure a utopia of social harmony. Like all other human cultures, Paleolithic societies had rules and structures. A gender-based division of labor usually cast men as hunters and women as gatherers. Values emphasizing reciprocal, and highlight that word, reciprocal, sharing of goods resulted in clearly defined roles about distributing the meat from an animal kill. Various rules about incest and adultery governed sexual behavior, while understandings about who could hunt or gather in particular territories regulated economic activity. Leaders arose as needed to organize a task such as a hunt, but without conferring permanent power on individuals. The economy and environment. For a long time, modern people viewed their gathering and hunting ancestors as primitive and impoverished, barely eking out a living from the land. In more recent decades, anthropologists studying contemporary Paleolithic societies, those that survived into the 20th century, began to paint a different picture. They noted that gathering and hunting people frequently worked fewer hours to meet their material needs than did people in agricultural or industrial societies, and so had more leisure time. One scholar referred to them as the original affluent society, not because they had so much, but because they wanted or needed so little. Nonetheless, life expectancy was low, probably little more than 35 years on average. Life in the wild was surely dangerous, and dependency on the vagaries of nature rendered it insecure as well. But Paleolithic people also acted to alter the natural environment substantially. The use of deliberately set fires to encourage the growth of particular plants certainly changed the landscape and, in Australia, led to the proliferation of fire-resistant eucalyptus trees at the expense of other plants. In many parts of the world, Australia, North America, Siberia, Madagascar, the Pacific Islands, the extinction of various large animals followed fairly quickly after the arrival of human beings, leading scholars to suggest that the Paleolithic humankind played a major role, coupled perhaps with changing climates, in the disappearance of these animals. Other hominid or human-like species such as the Neanderthals in Europe or the Flores man discovered in 2003 in Indonesia also perished after living side by side with Homo sapiens for millennia. Whether their disappearance occurred through massacre, interbreeding, or peaceful competition, they were among the casualties of the rise of humankind. Thus, biological, environmental, inhabited by gathering and hunting peoples, was not wholly natural, but was shaped in part by their own hands. The realm of the spirit. The religious or spiritual dimension of Paleolithic culture has been hard to pin down because bones and stones tell us little about what people thought. Art is subject to many interpretations, and the experience of contemporary gathering and hunting peoples may not reflect the distant past. Clear evidence exists, however, for a rich interior life. The presence of rock art deep inside caves and far from living spaces suggests a ceremonial separate from ordinary life. The extended rituals of contemporary Australian Aboriginals, which sometimes last for weeks, confirm this impression, as do numerous and elaborate burial sites found throughout the world. No full-time religious specialist or priest led these ceremonies, but part-time shamans, people believed to be especially skilled at dealing with the spirit world, emerged as the need arose. Some people often entered an altered state of consciousness or a trance while performing the ceremonies, often with the aid of psychoactive drugs. Precisely how Paleolithic people understood the non-material world is hard to reconstruct, and speculation abounds. Linguistic evidence from ancient Africa suggests a variety of understandings. Some Paleolithic societies were apparently monotheistic, and highlight that word, monotheistic. Others saw several levels of supernatural beings, including a creator deity, various territorial spirits, and the spirits of dead ancestors. Still others believed in an impersonal force, sufficed through the natural world that could be accessed by shamans during a trance dance. The prevalence of Venus figurines and other symbols all across Europe has convinced some, but not all scholars, that Paleolithic religious thought had a strongly feminine dimension embodying a great goddess and concerned with the regeneration and renewal of life. Many gathering and hunting peoples likely developed a cyclical view of time that drew on the changing phases of the moon and on the cycles of female fertility, meaning birth, menstruation, pregnancy, new birth, and death. These understandings of the cosmos, which saw endlessly repeating patterns of regeneration and disintegration, differed from the later Western views, which saw time moving in a straight line toward some predetermined goal. Nor did Paleolithic people make sharp distinctions between the material and spiritual worlds, for they understood that animals, rocks, trees, mountains, and more animated by spirit or possessed souls of their own. Earlier, scholars sometimes dubbed such views as animistic and regarded them as primitive or simple in comparison to literate religions. More recent accounts generally avoid the term, preferring to focus on specifics of particular religious traditions, rather than some overall evolutionary scheme. And that's it, kiddos. Thanks for hanging out with me for 13 minutes. I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.